In the years following the First World War, Germany faced a crisis that would reshape its economy and society in ways few could have anticipated. The Treaty of Versailles imposed substantial reparations on the defeated nation, payments that would strain its already weakened financial system. What followed was not a sudden catastrophe, but a gradual unraveling that began with decisions that seemed, at the time, entirely reasonable. The German government needed to fund its obligations while managing the costs of reconstruction and social welfare for millions of citizens. Traditional methods of raising revenue through taxation proved insufficient and deeply unpopular, with a population already exhausted by war. Instead, officials turned to a solution that appeared both practical and politically expedient. They would simply print more money. This approach had a certain logic. The government could meet its immediate obligations without the political difficulty of raising taxes or cutting spending. Other nations had expanded their money supply during wartime without catastrophic results. German officials believed they could manage the process carefully, creating just enough currency to bridge the gap until economic recovery took hold. Records indicate that the first signs of trouble appeared gradually. Prices began to rise, but not alarmingly at first. A loaf of bread that cost 1 mark in 1919 might cost 2 marks a few months later. This seemed manageable, perhaps even temporary. The Reichsbank, Germany's central bank, continued its policy, convinced that stability would return once reparations were renegotiated and industrial production recovered. But the process fed on itself in ways policymakers had not fully grasped. As prices rose, workers demanded higher wages to maintain their standard of living. Businesses raised prices to cover these increased labor costs. The government, facing higher expenses, printed more money to meet them. Each cycle accelerated the next. By 1922, the pace of change had quickened noticeably. Prices that once shifted monthly now changed weekly. The mark, which had traded at 4 to the dollar before the war, had fallen to thousands per dollar. Foreign creditors grew increasingly concerned about Germany's ability to meet its obligations, and this concern itself worsened the situation as international confidence in the currency collapsed. The government faced a dilemma with no clear resolution. Stopping the printing presses would mean defaulting on obligations and potentially triggering civil unrest. Continuing meant watching the currency deteriorate further. Officials chose to continue, hoping that some external intervention or economic turnaround would arrest the decline. Evidence points to a growing disconnect between official policy and economic reality during this period. The Reichsbank published reassuring statements about monetary stability even as its own statistics showed the money supply expanding at unprecedented rates. Ministers spoke of temporary difficulties while shopkeepers began changing prices multiple times per day. By 1923, the situation had moved beyond anyone's control. A loaf of bread that cost hundreds of marks in January cost hundreds of thousands by summer. By November, that same loaf might cost billions. Workers received their wages twice daily and rushed to spend them immediately, knowing that every hour of delay meant a substantial loss of purchasing power. People carried money in wheelbarrows not as an exaggeration, but as a practical necessity. The social consequences extended far beyond simple inconvenience. Lifetime savings became worthless overnight. A pension that had represented security vanished into meaninglessness. Middle-class families who had carefully built modest wealth found themselves destitute. The traditional virtues of thrift and saving became liabilities rather than assets. Historians suggest that the psychological impact proved as significant as the economic damage. Citizens lost faith not just in their currency, but in the institutions that managed it. The idea that responsible behavior and planning could ensure stability seemed naive in retrospect. This erosion of trust would have consequences that extended well beyond the monetary crisis itself. The hyperinflation finally ended in late 1923, when the government introduced a new currency, the Rentenmark, backed by real assets rather than government promises. The exchange rate was set at 1 Rentenmark to 1 trillion old marks. Effectively, the old currency was abandoned, and with it, all debts and savings denominated in it simply disappeared. The cost proved difficult to calculate in purely financial terms. Some benefited, particularly those who had borrowed heavily and could now repay debts with worthless currency. But the broader damage was substantial. The middle class, traditionally a stabilizing force in society, had been largely wiped out. Public faith in democratic institutions had been severely undermined. The crisis created conditions that would contribute to political extremism in the years that followed. What makes this episode particularly instructive is how reasonable each individual decision appeared at the time. Printing money to meet obligations seemed more responsible than defaulting. Continuing the policy seemed preferable to the immediate pain of stopping. Officials genuinely believed they could manage the process, and that economic recovery would solve the underlying problems. The mistake was not a single dramatic choice, but rather a series of incremental decisions, each one appearing justified by immediate circumstances, each one making the next seem necessary. The government prioritized short-term stability over long-term consequences, and by the time the true cost became apparent, the situation had moved beyond their ability to control it. The German hyperinflation of 1923 stands as a reminder of how quickly confidence in fundamental institutions can erode, and how difficult that confidence is to restore once lost. The economic damage took years to repair, but the social and political consequences shaped the nation's trajectory for decades. What began as a practical solution to immediate problems became one of the most costly policy failures of the 20th century. Its full price paid not in money, but in the stability and trust that no amount of currency could replace.